Part 19. On the isolation floor, the attendants at the security checkpoint looked up at the monitor as someone entered the corridor. They saw Sarah holding Silberman at syringe point. Sarah spoke to them through an intercom on the wall. "Open it up or he'll be dead before he hits the floor." The attendant's adrenaline levels started going off the scale. The first attendant adamantly shook his head. No. The second attendant keyed the intercom mic. "There's no way, 82. Let him go." Silberman's face was the colour of suet, but he managed. "It won't work, Sarah. You're no killer. I don't believe you'd do it." Her voice was as deadly as a cold hiss. "You're already dead, Silberman. Everybody here dies. You know I believe that, so don't fuck with me." She punctuated the last by jabbing the needle deeper into his skin. "Open the goddamn door!" he screamed, wincing. The attendants looked with uncertainty at one another. One of them finally hit the solenoid button. The far door unlocked with a metallic clang. Sarah pushed Silberman ahead of her into the lockout corridor. The nearer, barred door had to be unlocked manually. One of the attendants cautiously approached and nervously unlocked it. "Step back!" Sarah ordered. He wasted no time moving back. She faced both of them. "Down on the floor! Now!" They hesitated. She gave them a feral expression and jammed the needle in all the way. Silberman grunted in agony as a trickle of blood began to flow. They quickly hit the floor with their stomachs. Sarah came through with Silberman, giving them a wide berth. She backed down the hall away from them, still holding her hostage. It suddenly occurred to her, in the middle of all her own adrenaline rush, that she was actually going to pull this off. But that was because she couldn't see the third orderly waiting just around the corner. He was poised, ready to jump her when she came abreast of him. Sarah backed towards him. Like a tango dancer in a violent dip, he lunged, grabbing her syringe hand. Sarah immediately spun on the orderly and caught him across the throat with the nightstick. He quickly lost all interest in her, dropping to his knees and gagging for air. Silberman pulled away, screaming at the top of his lungs, "Get her!" They scrambled up as Sarah took off like a shot around the corner. One of them hit the panic button and alarms began to sound. In the isolation ward, the T-1000 was looking in at a very stoned attendant inside the nurse's station when the alarm shrieked through the halls, making the attendant startle to his feet, wide-eyed. He gaped in astonishment as he saw what looked like Lewis reach into its chest and pull out a pistol, then move on to the security entrance. In another corridor, in the maze of the vast hospital, Sarah ran like an animal, her bare feet slapping on the cold tiles. The orderlies were charging after, not far behind her. She turned a corner, caroming off the wall, and sprinted on without slowing, slamming into a steel door. Locked. Footsteps pounded behind her. She fumbled with Douglas's keys, breathing hard, jammed the master in. The orderlies were bearing down on her at full tilt, rapidly closing the gap. Sarah got the door open and dove through, slamming it and turning the deadbolt knob just as the first orderly grabbed the latch on the other side. He was 1 second too late. Sarah saw them through the little window, fumbling with their keys. Gasping from exhaustion, she turned. She was in another Sallyport corridor. A jail cell-type barred door was between her and the corridors of the ward beyond. She sprinted to the wall of bars, jabbed the key into the door, unlocking and pulling it open, just as she heard the latch on the one she'd just come through being turned. Sarah flung herself frantically through the barred door as the first orderly came through behind her. She yanked the bars shut. Clang. With a stab of despair, she saw the keys were dangling from the lock on the other side from her. The orderly was racing at her, white-lipped with rage. She reached back through the bars, turned the key, and purposefully snapped it off in the lock. An instant later, the big orderly slid into the door, grabbing through the bars for her as she danced back, just out of reach. He lunged against the steel bars, enraged. Sarah had no time for any sense of personal triumph. She was on a committed run to find her son, before the second Terminator did. So she simply spun and sprinted away. The frustrated attendants shouted at each other, struggling to fit their keys into a lock already occupied by the broken-off key tip. Silberman stumbled up behind them, holding his throbbing neck, took in their confusion, and screamed at them, "Go around, goddammit! Go around!" The orderlies ran past Silberman, back the way they came, and careened into an intersection to another set of doors. Sarah rounded a corner and saw the elevators ahead. Home free. At a full tilt dash, she had nearly reached it when the elevator doors parted. And then she saw the worst nightmare come alive and step out into the hall, complete with blood-stained leather jacket, sunglasses, and shotgun. The horrifying familiar face of the Terminator swiveled to hers. Sarah tried to stop, but her momentum was carrying her right into the killer cyborg. Her bare feet slipped on the slick tile, and she hit the floor, gaping up at the leather-clad figure. Sarah lost all semblance of courage and a sizable chunk of her sanity. She was not even aware that she was screaming as she scrambled back along the floor like a crab, spinning and clawing her way to her feet along the wall. She felt as if she were whirring in the nuclear winds of her vision. If she looked back, she would have seen John step warily out into the corridor behind the Terminator. John saw his fleeing mother and realized instantly what had happened. "Mom, wait!" Sarah couldn't hear over the sound of her own wail. She kept going, a cornered rat, desperate for an opening in the hellish maze of the hospital. The Terminator and John ran after her. She pelted down the long corridor, back the way she'd come. As she reached an intersection with a cross corridor, a white-clad figure emerged in a blur. The attendant hit her in a flying tackle. She skidded across the floor, shrieking and struggling. The other two orderlies leaped into the fray. "No, it's coming now! It's gonna kill us all!" she shouted, pleading, trying to get them to understand what was only a few steps away. Heedless, they grabbed her thrashing limbs. They didn't even look where the out-of-control woman was pointing. Back along the corridor. They pinned her to the cold tiles, a ring of furious faces above her. A female attendant appeared, holding a syringe with a full load of tranq. Sarah craned her neck and saw the dark silhouette of the Terminator coming up behind them. It was maddeningly identical to the first Terminator, and it was here now, years later. Skynet's walking weapon, punching through time and distance to kill her. She screamed in utter hopelessness. But the Terminator did something very strange and very different from her expectation. Holding the shotgun in one hand, the cyborg reached down and grabbed one of the orderlies with his other hand, hurling the 200-pound man all the way across the corridor into the far wall. Smack! He dropped to the floor, trying to breathe around two cracked ribs and not liking how it felt one bit. The other two orderlies reacted instantly, leaping onto the intruder. The Terminator seemed to disappear for a moment under the two big guys. Then there was an explosion of white as the orderlies were flung outward as if they'd stepped on a landmine. One crashed through a safety glass window and was saved from worse injuries by the outer steel security bars. But he wasn't conscious long enough at that moment to be thankful. The other ploughed through an office door, splintering it into kindling and rolling up against the desk leg. He looked up and decided the acoustical tiles on the ceiling were extremely fascinating subjects for study, considering that he was going to have to look at them from that stunned position for some time. The female attendant, who could easily bench press 90 pounds, backhanded the intruder's face with all her strength. The man recoiled slightly, his sunglasses flying off. Her hand throbbed, as if she just slammed it against a cement wall. He slowly turned back to her and put a palm on her chest. She grabbed his thumb and tried to pry it back with a force she should have broken it. Instead, He simply shoved her away. It was hardly more than a tap, but executed with such kinetic energy that the woman was thrown backwards several yards and slammed onto the hard floor. She skidded to a stop, not particularly interested in getting up for a while. During all of this, Silberman was flattened against the wall, a forgotten cigarette dangling from his lips. He watched the utterly expressionless face of the intruder as he strode back to Sarah. His confusion about the motive of this man suddenly became awesomely clear. Sarah was right. This guy wasn't human. Not even close. And if she was right about this humanoid thing, he realized that she was probably right about all the other things. The unimaginably tragic things. He felt the fabric of his reality start to tear. Sarah blinked, staring up at the looming figure of death. Her eyes shifted to an impossible sight. Her son, kneeling next to her. "Mom, are you okay?" She looked from the Terminator to John, and then back to the Terminator. Here she was, on the floor, amid several bodies, staring up at the worst and best things in her world. She had no way to react to this except madness, or laughter. She decided which way to go when John leaned in and grabbed her shoulders, shaking her hard. "Mom!" She felt his grip, smelled his breath, and in an instant of massive shock realized this was real. Surviving that knowledge was the easy part, because what happened next was just too silly to be sane. The Terminator politely reached its hand down to her, palm up. Evidently, it wanted to help her up. Sarah started to laugh, the convulsion racking her like a deep orgasm, but it was choked off in her throat by what the cyborg tonelessly said. "Come with me if you want to live." Sarah glanced around. The orderlies were stirring back to pained consciousness. The alarms were still blaring. Soon, more people would arrive. Her son started tugging at her arm. "It's all right, Mom. He's here to help." In a quite understandable daze, Sarah took the huge hand in her shaking fingers. The Terminator lifted her to her feet in one easy movement, almost like a dance. John turned to go and saw a policeman standing 30 feet away, on the other side of the wall of bars. John realized, with a start, who it was. It was him. The Terminator followed John's horrified gaze. The T-1000 had his pistol in his hand, at his side. The Terminator pushed John and Sarah behind him. They all started backing up. Sarah saw what they saw, and was unable to react, her soul on overload. The T-1000 walked forward. Because of the man's obesity, it had been stressing its ability to expand molecularly by remaining in the Lewis form, so it had defaulted back to the more energy-efficient Officer Austin. It reached the bars, but it did not stop. Its body began to divide like jello around the metal bars. As it squeezed itself through like Play-Doh, its surface reformed perfectly. The cigarette in Silberman's mouth fell out as his jaw dropped. A faint snapping sound went off in his head, and he started to shrink inside his body. Now Sarah could react. She gasped. All frames of reference had been shattered. But the sight of the viscous paste reforming into a policeman, and three thoughts hit her simultaneously. It wasn't a policeman. It was from the future. It was probably going to try to kill her son. Her rage began to blast up from her center again, and her muscles went taut. For her, it seemed the reality of the nightmare would never end. There was a clink. The guard's gun had caught against the bars, the only solid object. The T-1000 simply turned its wrist and tried again, slipping the gun endwise through the gap. The Terminator grabbed John by the seat of his pants and hooked him up onto his back. John clutched him around the neck. The Terminator raised the shotgun and continued backing away. He turned to Sarah. "Run!" Good idea, Sarah thought, then turned and ran after them. The T-1000 lunged towards them. Its boot slammed down on the Terminator's fallen sunglasses, crushing them. It opened fire with the Browning high power, but the Terminator straight-armed the 10-gauge like a pistol and fired. The stunned orderlies flopped face down on the floor as the corridor was filled with high-velocity lead and acrid smoke. The Terminator was hammered by several slugs. The T-1000 was in turn cratered by several slugs. It staggered, but kept coming on. It was measuring the velocity and angle of each hit, and actually opening itself up slightly to cushion the shock of the entry wounds. Bright mercury formed in the craters as they closed and resealed, disappearing in a second. Bullets could only slow it down. The Terminator made it around the corner and broke into a thundering run. Ahead, Sarah was already at the elevator. The Terminator and John piled in, and John slapped the garage level button. The doors started to close. The T-1000 cleared the corner with odd grace, fluidly shifting the center of its gravity in ways no human could. The Terminator slammed John and Sarah back against the side walls as the T-1000 charged them, rapid-firing the Browning. The rounds hit the doors as they closed. Inside, Sarah saw the metal being punched in from the far side in a perfect grouping that would have taken her head off had there been nothing between her and the bullets. The Browning locked open, empty. The T-1000 dropped it without a glance back. The doors closed with a soft clump. Then they were rocked in their foundation as the T-1000 hit them a split second later. The elevator hadn't moved yet. A sword-like blade rammed in between the doors, then impossibly melted, and then rehardened into hooks. They locked onto the doors and began to force them open. The Terminator seemed to hesitate, while Sarah watched with horror as the safety of their temporary sanctuary was being ripped open. But Terminators do not hesitate. It had been calmly waiting, time a mere calculation of the passing of events, until the gap widened enough for him to jam his shotgun through. The muzzle slammed right into the T-1000's face, sinking a few inches into the flesh. An instant later, Sarah and John jerked as the report from the shotgun battered their eardrums in the confined space. Through the slit, they watched the T-1000's head blown apart by the blast. It was hurled back by the tremendous release of energy. The elevator doors were now allowed to close. The car jerked slightly, then began its descent. John looked up at his mother. She was staring dazedly at the elevator doors, shaking. "What the fuck was that?" she muttered hoarsely. In the corridor, the T-1000's head was lying in two mutilated masses on its shoulders. The concept of pain had never factored into the sensory sphere of the liquid machine. Pain was an indicator of damage to a part of the organism. But this organism didn't have parts, except on the molecular level, and its molecules were each primitive, miniaturized versions of the total machine. If any section were parted, the separated halves would revert to metal polyalloy. The only default command it had in molecular memory was to find the main mass again and rejoin it. Each molecule had a range of 14 kilometers, and the blasted apart sections of the T-1000 were much closer than that. So after a moment of hesitation, caused by ballistic shock, it rapidly reformed into a healthy human face, with absolutely no trace of injury. It turned to the closed doors and jammed its hands in between them, the fingertips becoming pry bars that were easily able to pull the doors apart. Without hesitating, the T-1000 leaped into the open shaft. It plummeted 2 floors, as aerodynamic as a brick. In the elevator, all three looked up at the loud thump on the roof. The Terminator rapidly finished reloading the shotgun and jacked around into the chamber. Sarah grabbed the .45 from his waistband and aimed it at the ceiling. Nothing was going to kill her son. Nothing. John took a short, sharp breath. Then, clang, A razor-sharp chromed spike punched through the ceiling and speared down 4 feet into the elevator car, inches from Sarah's face. Reflexively, she opened fire. Bam, bam, bam! The bullets punching right through the roof. Lightning fast, the spike withdrew and thrust down again, slashing the Terminator's jacket and missing John by inches. The blast from the Terminator's 10-gauge opened a hole in the ceiling, the first of many, as the Terminator rocked out in a fury of firing, as the metal shaft slashed down again and again, as if a crazed man were jabbing a can with a surgically sharp ice pick. Sarah yelled in agony as one of the strikes sliced open her shoulder blade. A polite bell went off. The indicator over the door flashed, "Garage level." The doors slid open, and Sarah pulled John out as soon as the gap was wide enough. They emerged into the basement. The Harley was parked nearby, useless now that there were 3 people. The Terminator scanned the area for an appropriate escape vehicle. In the elevator, the T-1000 had bashed a hole in the ceiling big enough to pour itself through. A massive blob of mercury-like alloy liquefied and extruded through the opening, then dropped to the floor, rising into the form of Officer Austin. As all its sensors repositioned, it hesitated a second, reorienting after the molecular taffy pull with itself. In the garage, a blue and white hospital security car roared up to the entrance and screeched towards them. Without breaking stride, Sarah ran right at the car, which skidded to a shrieking halt. She aimed the .45 in the guard's face, holding it firmly with both hands. "Out of the car!" The guard took a moment to figure out that this gun-toting patient was probably very insane, too insane to reason with. It was a moment too long for Sarah. She put a round through the glass next to his head to hurry him up. "Right now!" The door was immediately opened, and the guard lurched out with his hands up. The cyborg ran up and almost absently flung the man out of the way as he slid behind the wheel. Sarah shoved John into the back seat and dove into the front passenger side. The Terminator yanked the car into reverse and punched the accelerator, spinning the tires on the slick ramp. The Terminator handed the shotgun over his shoulder to John and said, "Reload." John pulled some shells from the pocket of his army jacket and started feeding them in. Sarah held on as the Terminator powered backward up the ramp, scraping along one wall, barely in control because the T-1000 was running at them from the elevator. It was completely unharmed, shifting from all chrome mode back to the cop form as it rapidly increased speed up the ramp. The Terminator handed Sarah another magazine for the .45. She dropped the expended one out and slapped in the full one, cocked the slide. The car backed out of the garage and along the service driveway towards the security gate. John finished reloading and handed the shotgun back to the Terminator. He leaned out of the window and took aim at the pursuer. The T-1000's face was right in the headlights. The Terminator fired, blowing a hole in its shoulder. Shiny liquid metal formed in the hole, closing it, then turning back into uniform. Sarah, half out of the passenger window, pulled the trigger of the .45. The first 2 shots went wide, but the third center punched the forehead. It only made the T-1000 break stride for a moment. She fired again and again. Bullet strikes cratered the thing in the chest and in the head. Instead of channeling power to reform, the T-1000 put all its energy into forward momentum, rapidly gaining on the car. It crashed through the main gate barricade. "Hold on," the cyborg driver calmly said as he cut the wheel hard. The car slewed into a reverse 180-degree turn, swapping ends with a screech. The T-1000 was almost on them. The Terminator's hand blurred over the shifter, and his foot pushed the accelerator all the way to the floor. The car surged forward. The T-1000 jumped into the air, landing on the trunk. Its hand became a metal spike, and it slammed down through the lid. A moment later, it formed into a gleaming chrome hook. Feet dragging on the pavement, the T-1000 slammed its other hand down, punching another hook into the back of the car. pulling itself up. The Terminator turned to Sarah and said, "Drive." She grabbed the wheel as he heaved himself half out of the driver's window. Sarah slapped her foot down on the throttle, keeping the car moving at 70 miles an hour. John was looking back through the rear window as the T-1000, fully on the car now, held on with one hooked hand while it raised the other to strike. The boy ducked just as it shoved the other hook hand through the back window, exploding the glass and missing him by inches. It drew back for another swing, lunging forward as the Terminator whipped the shotgun down over the roof of the car and fired. The T-1000's arm was hit just above the hand anchoring it to the car. The 10-gauge blew the wrist apart, severing the hooked hand. Officer Austin tumbled backward off the accelerating car. John rose and looked out the shattered window, eyes wide. The T-1000 hit the pavement hard, but, in a single movement, rolled back to its feet and continued running after them. But now he was dropping way behind. Sarah had the pedal floored and the liquid metal killer had its limitations. It couldn't catch them on foot. John saw the crowbar hand still stuck into the trunk right in front of him. He gingerly reached out and pried the metal loose, tossing it onto the street. It stretched into an ovoid by the forward momentum, then fell back into a quivering blob. The car sped off into the night. A moment later, the T-1000, slowing to a walk, watched the taillights recede. The target's escape meant nothing to it. The delay could only be a measurement of time. Although Terminators had internal chronometers, the T-1000 did not. It was part of Skynet's new design. Knowledge of time had its uses, but in most cases of pursuit, it was an unnecessary element. Time did not matter when the thing after you could not be killed, could not be stopped, and would never tire. The T-1000, blissfully unaware of anything except the target's projected escape route, glanced down. The liquid metal blob on the asphalt began to shudder, then elongate, stretching like a liquid finger until it touched Officer Austin's shoe, flowing into it, rejoining the main mass. Time was only a temporary respite from the inevitable.